Now that I'm almost Medicare age, I tend to jumble up the decades that preceded my reaching the 60s. Somewhere, I think, in my 30s, maybe my 20s, I'm not really absolutely certain. And I watched Hamilton last night, so I never Googled this to get it correct for the 11 o'clock Mass, so I'm consistent. In all three Masses this weekend, I don't have the reference for this opening, which is basically a song called Don't Worry, Be Happy. The song was popular. It has kind of Caribbean reggae pop type of beat to it. And the whole concept of it was that you could just simply don't worry and be happy. That's all you had to do to enjoy this life. A very popular song, but many of us thought, well, it sounds good. It was much like those Have a Nice Day stickers that we would see before, that it sounds really sweet, but no one really experiences that. Someone says, don't worry, as if you could just turn the worry button right off, and you know that you can't. And so when someone says it's simple, don't worry, be happy, this is like if someone is clinically depressed and they tell you that they're depressed, you can't look at her like the character does in Moonstruck, the Cher character, slap her face and go, snap out of it. It's not something you can easily do when you're experiencing depression. But those words, don't worry, be happy, are not just meaningless words. That's why the song so appealed to so many people that heard it. I also, as I started Mass yesterday morning for our crew members all around the world, many of whom are, a few of whom are American, and many of them are Filipino and Indonesian, separated and away from their families. I learned in serving on the ships that these men and women learned English as their second language, and they do it fairly well. In order to do the hospitality work on a cruise ship, and since so many people speak English, the crew members need to be able to do it really well. And it's something I learned from our Vietnamese seminarians about how complicated our language is. One of the first things that you learn are greetings. You know, good morning. Somebody says good morning back. That kind of works in almost every language. But English has a phrase you and I don't think about very often that doesn't make sense to a foreigner that's learning English as a second language. The phrase is this. It follows good morning. Good morning. Good morning. How are you? Now, we know, without having to think about it, the answer, there are two acceptable answers to this question. Okay, you can say good, I suppose, or fine. Those are the words that are meant, much like the Lord be with you and with your spirit. They don't need to be changed, they don't need to be altered. See, the foreigner learning the language for the first time, how are you, means what they're taught. You really are interested in knowing how the person is. You and I know that if you do ask, how are you, and someone who we don't know replies back, it's terrible, they've lost their job, they've run out of money, their mother's dead, or something god awful like that, you realize, oh my God, I've gotten into a conversation that I don't want into. It's like the Hotel California. You can check in every time, but you can't leave. So we know that how are you is just simply a greeting, and it's not really an invitation for a person to open up. So those two examples kind of set the table for Jesus telling us, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Lovely. You could put it on a Hallmark greeting card. You could put it on a bumper sticker. You could go right underneath, have a happy day. Heck, you could sing it in Don't Worry, Be Happy. All of those sayings are very nice. It's one of the most popular sayings of Jesus. Come to me who you are labored and burdened, for I'm meek and humble of heart. Who can dislike that? My goodness. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Those words are like to us, how are you? They're just words. We don't dig underneath them to make them really mean something. We know that life is not easy. We know that life is challenging, and therefore it just doesn't seem like anything but a polite greeting is coming from Jesus, who's really telling us, have a nice day, don't worry, be happy. Hang on to that thought, because that is actually what he is telling us. But let's open up the gospel a little bit. The images that Jesus uses for the yoke, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. For those of us like me that were raised in Louisville and the suburbs the entire time of my life, agricultural metaphors don't work very well for me. I don't really understand them. So you had to Google this. My mother used to call it goggle. I had to goggle this and actually figure out what was meant by the yoke and the burden. In Jesus' time, where agriculture would have been the predominant dominant way people provided for themselves, they would have known what a yoke of oxen was. But you had to bring oxes together into a group, and you had to put some type of harness on them. That's what a yoke is, a harness. I know when you and I hear harness, we think 50 Shades of Grey. Well, let's not go there. That's not what I mean by harness, but a harness is actually something that's meant to keep your eyes looking forward so that you can't turn your head back and forth. I don't know much about oxen, but apparently when plowing, it's not really a good idea if they can move wherever they want. So the whole point of the yoke was to keep them moving in a direction. And of course, then oxen were used because the loads were heavy. You wouldn't need one if you're carrying a feather, for heaven's sakes. Why go to all of that trouble? So you're talking about, it's like me coming back from the grocery store because I'm a man. Why would you make several trips to your car when you can try to get all 13 bags in your hand at the same time? It's that same idea then that when you have a heavy burden, you need something to make sure that it can be done easily. So people at Jesus' time would have understood immediately that he was speaking about something challenging. He was speaking about something hard. He was using a metaphor that they know all too well as being one of the hard challenges of daily living and turning it on his head. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. Or in modern parlance, don't worry. Be happy. Here we are on 4th of July weekend, and as I said, the church calls it the 14th Sunday of Ordinary Time all around the world. And for most of us, we're in an increased and heightened level of anxiety, and almost every one of us against our will. Let me start off with a general notion. We're already anxious enough before all the current events took place. All of us come from families, they come with no instructions, as you know. They mostly come with dysfunction, as well, you know. They're completely unpredictable, and they're a stew pot of anxiety. And so we're already dealing with personal situations that are burdensome enough. Some of us have work situations that become burdensome. I don't, but some people actually do. I've had them before. I don't want to have them again. But we have different things, medical conditions that could create all kinds of problems, economic conditions. So just in the normal course of things, life is already challenging. Boy, did we not know that at St. James last year as we struggled with our school ministry and struggled with how we're going to move forward. So we know just how to carry around daily anxiety. So on top of that, let's add a pandemic to end all pandemics. It's completely turned our world upside down. Something I thought I'd never see in my life. Churches were closed. I mean, people couldn't come to church. As you know, it's only been 4 weekends that we've all been together, the group together, and you're wearing masks, which are a kind of yoke. And I'm not going to tell you, they're really comfortable because you're in an air-conditioned space, because I'm not wearing one right now, and I know they're not comfortable. But we do that in order to protect others and to protect ourselves. So we're already experiencing the pandemic and all the different things that are happening. And let's face it, we don't know what's going to happen next, and the news doesn't look good. The rates of infection are increasing. You hope there's going to be some type of medication. Those of us that are older think, my goodness, how long are we going to be literally stuck in our houses? Is this what our life is going to be like? That's pretty bad on top of our normal stress. But then on top of that, the economy's falling down. Oh, the stocks are taking off, and most of us aren't enjoying the benefit of that. We're experiencing massive unemployment, all kinds of different problems that are rippling around. I'm told it mirrors the Great Depression, which I only knew about from my grandparents talking about, and I always thought they made half of it up. But apparently they didn't. The Great Depression really was difficult, and we're in the middle of that. So on top of a pandemic, we have a Great Depression. That's bad enough. But on top of that, before all this started, we were already in political civil war in America, which we all know, which means heightened tempers, heightened anxieties, partisanship that's really difficult for anyone that cares about it. And no end to that appears to be in sight. And if that wasn't bad enough, we've now added racial tension to the mix, because let's see how heavy we can make this load and how tight we can make this yoke. Racial tension we haven't seen in 3 decades, and you and I don't know where that's going to go either. So on top of our personal situations, there are 4 mega things going on. It's kind of hard to hear the words. Don't worry, be happy. You and I know we have ample reason to worry. Worry. I've always been intrigued by this concept of worry. And I'm reminded of a person I knew at Ascension Her name is Joyce, not the Joyce that's sitting here that came from Ascension. That's later Joyce. This is earlier Joyce. They didn't know the Joyce I'm speaking of except when I talked about her to them. I think they already know the story. Joyce was a chronic worrier. In fact, of all of the people I've met, she wins the award for the person that worried the most. She literally worried herself to death. I celebrated her funeral. She would come to me. She had 4 children. They were grown. They had children of their own. And for Joyce to be happy, she had to be in utter, total, complete control of their lives. She worried about everything. I can only imagine her in the pandemic, except I can't imagine her in the pandemic. It was bad enough when times were good. And she worried day and night. She fretted if they didn't go to church, which most of them didn't. She fretted if one of them was having trouble in the job. She fretted on this, that, or the other thing. And then as she got older and got sicker, she fretted about that on top of that. So she came to me frequently. We would talk about her anxiety. So I really realized this was a problem for her. And so one day I finally thought about this, and I met with her and I said, Joyce, if you could give me one good outcome that has ever come from all this worrying that you're doing, I will give you written permission to worry. I'd sort of used that line with others before, and they quickly caught the idea that there really isn't a good outcome to worrying it, so they need to try to worry less. But Joyce was the prize winner. She looked at me and thought a little longer, and I looked at her. I was going to wait for her to speak. Finally, like a pregnant pause had gone long enough, and she looked up and she said, I'll have to think about that more. And she never answered my question. I had her funeral, I think 6 or 7 months later, and really had seen her worrying herself to death. That's an extreme example, but underneath it is a more easy to grasp example that our worrying is what fuels our anxiety. Anxiety is fear of the future. Here's the reality about the future. We don't know what it is. That's why we're afraid. We don't know what it is. Guess what? We never know what it is. So even if the pandemic is solved, even if the depression turns into prosperity beyond our wildest dreams, even if black and white come together in a mixed, diverse society that you and I would have never imagined when we did that, and if all the other things, the partisan political divide becomes, everybody becomes one like that Coca-Cola commercial, we are the world, even if all of those things happen, people will still find reason to worry because we still won't know what the future holds. There is no answer to that question. I know this because I'm preaching from my own experience. It's anxiety causing when we have to not know what's waiting for us around the corner. So we walk around and carry lots of worry. There's a scene in the movie Parenthood. I love that movie. It's a comedy, but it's also got some really good emotional moments, and it really, really talks about the modern family and the relationships and the challenges that come. Steve Martin is a neurotic parent of a number of children with all kinds of problems, and his kind of domineering father, Jason Robards, and he don't really get along. There's another brother of his, played by Tom Hulce, who's a spendthrift. His dad, Jason Robards' project. He's going to somehow save him from wasting his money and doing all this fraud and squat things and get his business over to him. Towards the end of the film, Jason Robards realized he's never going to be able to, quote, rescue that second son. And there's this touching scene where he goes to where Steve Martin's having baseball practice with this neurotic child, and they're sitting on the sidelines, and Steve is shocked that Jason is even asking him for advice. And he pours out his heart to him about how he wanted to turn the business over to him. He wanted to be able to retire early. And then this line that I love so much, he looks at him and he says, you know, it never ends when you have children. It never ends. You always worry about them. Really heartfelt. And so Steve Martin actually says something sweet back to his dad, something he hadn't done the entire film, about what a good job he still was doing, and then he had his own struggles with his own children. He kind of pours out his heart about the kid that's playing out on the baseball field. It's a psychological mess. I love what happens at the end of that scene. Jason Robards suddenly smiles, pinches Steve Martin's cheek, and he goes, you know what? You worry too much. It's a lovely scene because it really actually crystallizes what our central problem is. We worry too much. Worry is the devil's playground. As long as we stay in there anxious about a future that we cannot predict, we will not be happy Because you see, worry and happy do not belong in the same sentence of English, which is why don't worry, be happy seems like an odd construction when we hear it. But we begin to realize that when we worry, the devil is messing with our mind. Our faith gives us the rescue. Here we are in the celebration of the Eucharist. This should have been the greatest worry of all. The apostles who accompanied Jesus to Jerusalem and then saw him executed before their eyes. Their mission completely shattered. All of their work gone for naught. The worst thing they could possibly imagine had happened to them, and most of them had contributed to it on top of that. And then you know the story didn't end there. That would have been an unhappy ending. The story ends on Easter Sunday when the apostles find an empty tomb and have to wonder what had happened to Jesus. And before the evening is over, he will appear to them in the upper room, and they will experience his presence exactly the way we experience his presence here this morning. Come to me, he says, those you who labor or burdened, and you will find rest. I am meek and humble of heart. How many of you are afraid to come to him? You're afraid he's going to yell at you. You're afraid he's going to punish you. I hear it all the time. You're so afraid. Is he a liar? He said, come to me, those you who are burdened, for I am meek and humble of heart. How much more of an engraved invitation do we need? And you know, when those thoughts go into our mind about we're not worthy, that we're going to get into trouble, that God's going to punish us, we're worrying. And what did I tell you? Worry is the devil's playground. When you start in that emotional state, the devil is trying to take you away from Jesus, which is exactly now what we do in the Eucharist. But you know what? It's not that he's taken away from us. The Zechariah reading, the first reading, said, your king will come to you. And this morning, Jesus doesn't stay up in that beautiful dome or even higher up into the heavens. In the most intimate encounter you and I can possibly imagine, we will take him into our very bodies. His presence will be immediately here in this moment. You see, there is no past or future when you celebrate Eucharist. It is the incredible present. You're filled with the presence of God. You're told the kingdom of God's not an idea or a happy commercial. It is something real and tangible, and it awaits us. I guess we could say, don't worry, be happy, and walk out the door, but it's not as simple as that. We do know that even if we embrace this, which I know you do as a part of your faith, we still find life difficult. It is challenging. Your challenges are not going to go away. But here's the truth about challenges, and I'm preaching to myself also when I say this. The challenges, while we're in them, seem endless because we can't see into the future. That's why we worry, and that's why worry is the devil's playground. Jesus says, come to me when you're labor and burdened, and I will give you rest. The rest he speaks of is not solving today's problem, although we want that. I get it. I want it also. It's not solving today's anxiety. That's all we're really asking for. I get it. But that's not it. He is saying that when our life comes to its end, he will come to us, and in the words of the gospel, take us to heaven himself. You don't have to even worry about heaven because all of the details have been worked out. And that's what Eucharist is, a daily reminder to us that Jesus isn't far away. He's intimately present, and he is a loving God who fulfills all of his promises. The only one you can trust. You can trust the devil to lie to you every time without fail, and you can trust God to tell you the truth every time without fail. Come to me, you who are labor and burdened, and I will give you rest, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Let me say it a simpler way. Don't worry, be happy.